Just 3 minutes before the ceremonial gates of Eton swung open for Prince George's historic welcome, Prince William made a phone call that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Prince Andrew, already en route, was abruptly barred from entry. What triggered this sudden blockade? And what secrets are hidden behind this chilling decision? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The order was not shouted. It was not dramatic in tone. It was calm, controlled, almost surgical. Yet within those few measured words, an unmistakable boundary was drawn. Prince William had waited until the final possible moment, until security teams were already positioned and invitations confirmed. Then, precisely 3 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, he instructed palace security to deny Prince Andrew access to the grounds. No explanation, no negotiation, just a directive. And in royal language, a directive like that is not a request, it is a line in the sand. Those close to the inner circle would later whisper that something had shifted in the hours leading up to the ceremony. There had been a private security briefing, unusually tense, attended by William and a select group of advisors. The details remain sealed, but insiders claim concerns were raised, concerns not only about optics, but about proximity, about presence, about what it would signal to the public and to George himself if Andrew appeared beside him on such a symbolic day. Because this was not just another school event. This was Prince George stepping into the institution that shaped kings. It was the quiet passing of expectation from one generation to the next. And William was determined that no shadow from the past would darken that threshold. Palace aides were reportedly blindsided. Some had already confirmed Andrew's attendance. Seating had been discreetly arranged. His arrival time had been logged. But when the call came through, it overrode everything. There was confusion. Then urgency. Then silence. Staff members who once operated with unquestioned loyalty to every royal suddenly found themselves navigating a divide within the family itself. Because Andrew had not been hiding. In recent months he had made subtle moves, appearing at select gatherings, reconnecting with old allies, quietly signaling that he still belonged. To some, it looked like persistence. To William, it looked like encroachment. Inside the firm, tension had been building long before that morning. Andrew's attempts to reassert himself had grown bolder. Invitations that were once politely declined were now being pursued. Old contacts were being revived. There was a sense, however faint, that he believed time had softened everything. That the scandal, the criticism, the distancing, it would all eventually fade. But William did not see fading. He saw risk. He saw headlines waiting to happen. He saw the possibility that George's milestone would be eclipsed by a single photograph, a single frame capturing them too close together. And at the center of it all was George young, observant, stepping into a world that demands strength before adulthood. For William, this ceremony was not about tradition alone. It was about protection, about defining the environment in which his son would grow. The monarchy had endured because it adapts, because it shields its future, even when it means confronting its past. Blocking Andrew was not impulsive, it was calculated. A message sent not only to one man, but to the institution itself. The next era will not carry old burdens unquestioned. William's confidence in asserting that boundary did not come easily. It came from years of watching reputations fracture and loyalties tested. It came from understanding that leadership is often lonelier than it appears. And as Andrew's car was discreetly redirected, as murmurs began to ripple through private channels, a new dynamic within the royal family crystallized. Authority had shifted. The heir was no longer waiting politely in the wings. He was acting. But this wasn't just about a ceremony, it was the culmination of months of tension, secrets, and veiled warnings. And it all traces back to a hidden agreement between Charles and William. Behind the gilded doors of Windsor, a pact was forged, one never meant to see the light of day. King Charles and Prince William, Bound by blood but driven by legacy, signed off on an understanding, Andrew would never again be allowed near the next generation of heirs. But why? And what changed? It began in hushed conversations just after Andrew's final public fall from grace. The royal family, already bruised by media storms and internal division, faced a new reckoning. While public statements remained vague and diplomatic, behind closed doors, decisions were being carved in stone. Charles, newly crowned and desperate to project unity, knew his younger brother's presence was a liability. But it was William who pushed for permanence. He didn't want a temporary distancing, he wanted an ironclad boundary. What emerged was an unspoken, unofficial yet unbreakable pact. Andrew would not appear at any event involving George, Charlotte or Louis. The crown would protect its future at all costs. Catherine, always reserved in public but fiercely protective in private, had been quietly voicing concerns. She worried about the emotional toll on George, the questions, the whispers, the risk of association. It was all too much. She feared the damage of one uncomfortable encounter or photograph could linger far longer than any press cycle. For William, that fear struck deeper than any political fallout. It was personal. He saw a son stepping into a world of obligation, tradition, and scrutiny, and he refused to let that world be tainted by unresolved shadows from the past. But not everyone agreed at first. The late Queen Elizabeth, in her final years, had resisted total exile for Andrew. Her judgment was rooted in a lifetime of service and sentiment, making it difficult to cut ties, even when trust had eroded. She believed in redemption, forgiveness, in giving a disgraced son a chance to remain quietly within the fold. But when she passed, the balance shifted. Charles no longer had to defer, and William, unburdened by her softness, moved swiftly to secure the future. Charles, however, remained cautious. Ever the image strategist, he feared overcorrection could backfire. A harsh exile might stir sympathy or backlash. But William saw no middle ground. To him, inaction was risk. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about clarity. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity. Either Andrew was in, or he was out, and when it came to George, the answer was final. Camilla kept her distance. Those close to her say she remained detached, refusing to sway Charles either way. Her silence, though subtle, spoke volumes. It allowed Charles to lean toward his son's stance without stirring friction at home. Meanwhile, Princess Anne, the stoic enforcer of legacy, offered quiet but firm support. She respected rules, she valued structure, and she believed that the monarchy must be built forward, not backward. Her nod, though never public, cemented William's resolve. And so the pact lived in silence. No press release, no official memo, just an understanding carried by the highest-ranking royals. It remained buried until that morning at Eton. When Andrew was turned away, the pact that once lived in shadows roared into the open. And with the public now sensing something far deeper at play, questions began to spread. If this was the line drawn for Andrew, what else had been decided behind closed doors? Yet while Charles kept his distance, William took a more personal approach, especially after one fateful conversation with George behind palace walls. One evening, young Prince George asked a question that froze William in his tracks. It was simple, innocent, but its implications were massive. That question would not only reshape William's view of Andrew, but would ignite a chain of events that ended in royal exile. They were in the drawing room of Kensington Palace, where most royal conversations begin softly and end silently. George had been quieter than usual that day, withdrawn. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up and asked, "Why doesn't Uncle Andrew come to anything?" It was a child's question, curious, unaware, free from judgment. But for William, it struck like lightning. His mind raced, not just with answers, but with implications. What had George heard? What had he read? And more importantly, what had been left unsaid for far too long? William hesitated. He wanted to protect his son's innocence, Yet he knew this was the moment the line between royalty and reality would start to blur. George had recently overheard something, perhaps from a schoolmate, a whispered joke, or a news headline accidentally glimpsed. Whatever it was, it planted a seed. And now that seed had grown into a question no parent, let alone a future king, could ignore. William felt his throat tighten. He couldn't lie, but the truth carried weight no 13-year-old should bear. He told George only that sometimes adults make choices that separate them from family for a time. But as he said the words, William felt his voice shift quieter, colder. He knew this wasn't enough. The truth wasn't just about Andrew's past. It was about protecting George's future. The emotional gravity of raising a boy born into legacy, into scrutiny, into unspoken obligation, had never felt heavier. And that night, William sat long after George had gone to bed, haunted not by the question, but by what it demanded of him. Catherine had been listening from the hallway. When she stepped into the room, she didn't speak at first. Her silence carried its own verdict. They both knew what this meant. It was no longer enough to sideline Andrew in public. Now, his very proximity, even his name, risked leaving shadows on the next in line. Catherine, fierce when it came to shielding their children, spoke with quiet finality. He must not be near them. Ever. It was not emotion. It was clarity. Her instincts, sharp as ever, recognized danger where others saw discomfort. That was the moment William's restraint gave way to resolve. The doubts, the hesitation, the soft diplomacy, it all ended with one innocent question from his son. From then on, William was no longer just a father or heir, he was protector, strategist, and barrier between the past and the crown's future. And he vowed, with unshakable certainty, that Andrew would never be allowed near George again. No ceremonies, no shared stages, not even a photo frame. But William wasn't just reacting emotionally, he had seen something sealed within confidential palace intelligence files. Buried in a royal archive labelled Red Tier Access Only was a file that few ever dared to open. But William did. And what he found confirmed his deepest fears, not just about Andrew's past, but his present ambitions. It was no longer a family matter. It was a matter of royal security. The red file wasn't ordinary. It wasn't part of the routine briefings or the public-facing reports handed to senior royals. It was born out of necessity, quietly compiled by the Royal Protection Service in the aftermath of Andrew's most explosive scandal. Meant to assess reputational damage and risk exposure, it became something else entirely. A living record of every subtle attempt Andrew had made to claw his way back into the fold. Most of it hadn't reached the headlines. That was the terrifying part. Because what William saw in those pages wasn't desperation, it was strategy. Inside were emails, transcripts, flagged encounters, and private observations from royal aides and intelligence partners. There were whispers of Andrew trying to use back channels to attend high-profile events, bypassing formal invites by leveraging old loyalties. Private dinners, charity galas, foreign receptions. He had made contact. Quiet, informal, always one layer removed but persistent. It wasn't the public stage he was seeking. It was relevance. And worst of all, proximity. Then came the section that left William cold. Hidden in a subsection of coded reports was a pattern, a series of meetings unofficial, undocumented between Andrew's former staff and individuals close to George's new educational circle. Tutors, consultants, estate managers, people who could theoretically facilitate an introduction. William could see the design unfolding. Andrew didn't need a public reunion. He wanted influence. Slowly, subtly, under the radar. And the moment William read it, something in him hardened. This wasn't just recklessness anymore. This was intrusion. Psychological evaluations accompanied the intelligence. Assessments suggesting Andrew's detachment from reality, his inability to comprehend the magnitude of his fall from grace, and his potential to undermine institutional credibility, if left unchecked. One page, heavily redacted, contained notes from a closed-door session with a former royal psychiatrist. Refuses to accept permanent exclusion. Expresses belief he can restore legacy through next generation. That sentence alone shattered any illusion that time would fix things. William saw it clearly this wasn't going to end on its own. Tension escalated behind palace walls. Anne, ever the gatekeeper of duty and order, reportedly confronted Charles in private. Her message was direct. Andrew's quiet campaign was a threat, and the family's hesitation had gone on too long. William, now armed with the file, didn't wait for permission. He marched into the king's private study with the red file in hand and laid it on the desk. The silence in that room was not of uncertainty, but of inevitability. William's words were final. "If you won't act, I will." What began as a precaution had now turned into a crisis. For the first time, Charles understood that this wasn't about family reputation, it was about legacy survival. The very institution they were protecting could crumble under the weight of one wrong headline, one misstep, one misjudged appearance. And yet, even as William prepared to take full control of the situation, the one man at the center of it all wasn't ready to retreat. Because Andrew had been planning something of his own, his final gamble, his last shot at reclaiming a seat in the narrative. But Andrew wasn't about to go quietly. As the day of the Eton ceremony approached, he launched a bold, desperate plan, one that would backfire spectacularly. Days before the Eton ceremony, Prince Andrew sent a letter not to William, not to Charles, but to George. A move so bold, so inappropriate that it crossed an irreversible line. And when the contents leaked, the palace scrambled to contain the fallout. The letter arrived in a cream envelope, hand-delivered, unmarked, addressed only with George's name and title. No official channel. No palace vetting. It bypassed every protocol. And that was the point. Andrew wanted the message to feel personal, raw, as though it came from an uncle reaching out, not a royal stripped of duty. But its words betrayed something else entirely. It read like a performance, a carefully crafted blend of remorse and manipulation. In it, Andrew wrote of mistakes and misjudgments, of redemption and second chances. But woven between the lines was a subtle implication that George, young as he was, could be the key to unlocking Andrew's return. He referenced their shared bloodline, hinted at future family unity, and even praised George's maturity beyond his years. But what appeared at first as flattery quickly soured. The underlying tone suggested expectation, an unspoken ask for sympathy, even loyalty. It was a plea masquerading as mentorship. And it landed like a grenade. Because when Catherine intercepted the letter, the impact was immediate and explosive. To Catherine, it wasn't merely inappropriate, it was invasive. An adult circumventing both parents to access their child. Not just emotionally, but symbolically. She reportedly confronted staff in a fury rarely seen, demanding to know how such a breach had been possible. Eyes turned inward, security scrambled to retrace every step, and when the internal paper trail revealed that a low-level aide had unknowingly accepted the envelope under the assumption it was approved correspondence, the palace erupted. The aide was dismissed. The damage, however, had already been done. William was incandescent, not just at Andrew, but at the machinery that had allowed this to happen under their noses. The confrontation within palace walls was swift and decisive. For William, this was the clearest signal yet that Andrew would stop at nothing. He was no longer just lingering on the outskirts, he was reaching in. Past boundaries. Past decency. And for what? To manipulate a 13-year-old into reshaping his image. In the days that followed, the royal household locked down. Internal reviews were launched. Access lists were shortened. Briefings tightened. But even amid the fury, there was one name that remained silent. Camilla. Sources say she was informed of the letter, but gave no opinion. No comment. No support. Her silence only amplified the distance growing between Andrew and what remained of the senior royals. It was Anne and Sophie who reportedly stepped forward, offering unflinching support to William and Catherine. Their message was simple: this family would not be compromised. The letter, now archived and restricted from public view, became a symbol inside the palace, a reminder of the line that had been crossed, of the trust that could never be restored, and of the man who believed he still had a voice in a chapter that no longer belonged to him. And just when it seemed the royal household might recover from the scandal, another twist emerged. Because Andrew wasn't acting alone. In the aftermath of Andrew's blocked arrival, palace surveillance teams uncovered something disturbing. An insider had been coordinating his entry. Someone with clearance, access, and a hidden agenda. The monarchy had a mole. The first red flag appeared in the Eton security logs, an early morning authorization attempt from a royal system IP, one only accessible from within the palace network. At first, it was dismissed as routine noise, possibly a staffer reviewing attendance or logistics. But a second clearance request followed. This one wasn't just passive, it attempted to flag Andrew's name as cleared under the guise of a visiting dignitary. The titles didn't match. The credentials were subtly altered. It reeked of a cover-up. When security cross-referenced the footage with the timestamp, the implication was undeniable. Someone inside had tried to smuggle Andrew into the event under a false designation. Within hours, an internal audit was underway. What began as a quiet review quickly turned into a full-scale inquiry. Emails, phone logs, access histories. It didn't take long before the trail led to a name that sent shock through the halls. A long-time royal aide, someone who had served the household for over a decade. Trusted, quiet, always present, never noticed. But in the last 6 months, their behavior had changed. Extended breaks, private calls, increased communication with Andrew's legal counsel masked as clerical support, but clearly something more. William was livid, his trust shattered. The aide was called in for questioning and reportedly gave little resistance. They claimed it was loyalty to Andrew, sympathy for his treatment. But leaked transcripts from internal memos suggested a different motive, an offer of financial support and a promise that when Andrew's return was successful, certain loyalists would be rewarded. It was a bribe wrapped in sentimentality, and someone had taken the bait. Charles, upon learning of the breach, erupted in private. His fury wasn't just at the act, but at the betrayal. The very walls he thought safeguarded the institution had been silently compromised. He had warned of reputational threats from the outside. But now, the threat had been growing inside, unnoticed, eating at the fabric of loyalty like rot in polished wood. With his authority, the aide was immediately dismissed, escorted out under discreet cover, and banned from royal grounds. No press release, no explanation, just removal. And still, the implications lingered. If Andrew had managed to plant influence inside the palace, who else might be playing double roles? The royal household entered a quiet lockdown. Access points restricted. Sensitive roles rotated. Every staff member was silently put on watch. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be proven. And all because one man refused to fade into history. But even as William restored order, the unease hadn't vanished. Because if Andrew was willing to use a mole to gain access, what else had he been planning behind closed doors? There had to be more. A greater ambition. A deeper strategy. This wasn't just desperation, it was the execution of a long gestating plan. As the mole was quietly removed, attention turned to Andrew's true intentions and a disturbing plan long in the making. Far from the image of a man defeated, Andrew had been working on something behind closed doors. A quiet, calculated campaign he called Operation Redemption. Its goal? Regain public favor, win over key family members, and reinsert himself into the royal spotlight through George. It wasn't desperation that fueled him, it was belief. The belief that time would soften the scandal, that memory could be manipulated, and that legacy, if rebranded properly, could offer him a way back in. Andrew had been meeting with private consultants in discreet London locations. Not lawyers, not image managers, architects of influence, PR strategists with experience in crisis rehabilitation, former diplomats, retired editors, people who knew how to plant stories, adjust perception, and engineer comebacks. And they weren't working for free. Behind the scenes, Andrew began to court sympathetic aristocrats' old allies who still saw him as a useful conduit to certain foreign networks. In private dinners and hushed conferences, he floated narratives that William was overreaching, that George needed balance, that the family was losing its traditions in a rush to modernize. It was subtle but deliberate. A whisper campaign. One meant to stir uncertainty, particularly among those royals who had grown uneasy with the firm's recent power shifts, but it didn't stop with words. Andrew began laying the groundwork for what appeared to be a philanthropic education initiative, a trust meant to support underprivileged boys aspiring to elite institutions. Conveniently headquartered just outside Eton. Publicly framed as charity, privately designed as a narrative tool. Had it succeeded, it would have painted Andrew as a misunderstood royal reclaiming purpose. And more importantly, it would have positioned him close to the next generation of heirs, specifically George. Sources close to the palace began to murmur about his long-term goal. He didn't want to be king. He wanted to be remembered. And he knew if he could insert himself even marginally into George's development, he could tie his name to the future of the monarchy. Mentor, advisor, uncle. The roles were interchangeable, but the result was the same. Relevance, re-established. But William saw through it. Every move, every smile, every sudden reappearance in tabloid columns, framed as accidental or reformed. He knew it wasn't random. It was rehearsed, coordinated. And worst of all, it was encroaching. William understood the cost of letting shadows near the throne. He had lived through it. And he was determined that George would not. Catherine's instincts aligned with his. The idea of Andrew inserting himself into George's life, even peripherally, was beyond unacceptable. It was dangerous. They had spent years shielding their children from the storm that surrounded the crown. And now, the storm was trying to get in through the side door. So, as the ceremonial day approached, William made the call not just to protect George, but to end Andrew's campaign before it reached its climax. Eton's gates opened to cheering crowds and proud parents, but one figure was missing. As Prince George stepped into his new chapter, Prince Andrew watched from afar, exiled in silence. But his absence wasn't just noticed, it was a statement. A new royal era had begun. The sunlit ceremony marked far more than a boy's admission into Britain's most prestigious institution. It marked a generational turning point. George, flanked by his parents, carried himself with quiet poise. There was nervous excitement in his eyes, but also something deeper, a sense of readiness. The moment, crafted with care, had been scrubbed of distraction, and the most glaring absence, the one not spoken aloud, but felt by every insider present, was Andrew. His name wasn't on the list. His seat wasn't reserved. His chapter, it seemed, had been deliberately closed. Yet behind the formality of the day, the drama still rippled beneath the surface. The scandal that had erupted just days earlier of a letter, a mole, a campaign unraveling was still fresh. But George remained untouched. That was William's design. He stood beside his son, every inch the future king. But behind his stoicism was a man who had made an unthinkable choice for the sake of his child. He had drawn a line few dared to enforce. And now, as George walked confidently into Eton's hallowed grounds, it was clear who had prevailed. Catherine, ever graceful, watched with a protective calm. She had fought silently behind the scenes, her influence felt in every decision, every tightened circle, every wall erected to keep certain legacies out. She didn't need to make declarations, her presence said everything. This wasn't just a new school year, it was a clean slate. A firm step forward. A signal that the mistakes of the past would not be allowed to linger where the future was being shaped. And far from the cameras, shielded behind tinted glass, sat Andrew. Sources confirm he had arrived nearby uninvited, unseen. He watched from a parked car, eyes reportedly fixed on the gates that once welcomed him with fanfare. There would be no applause for him now, no quiet nods of forgiveness. His expression, one source claimed, was one of disbelief, as if he hadn't expected the wall to be real until it finally stood between him and the world he once called his own. Outside the palace, public sentiment was swift and clear. William's decision, once whispered in corridors, was now praised across headlines and households. He had acted not just as a father, but as a leader, and in doing so he had reminded the world that protecting the crown sometimes means protecting it from within. But the final blow was yet to come, and it wouldn't be delivered by William or Charles, but by someone no one expected. Just when Andrew believed the storm might pass, a handwritten letter arrived at Clarence House signed by Princess Anne. In it, she outlined her position, her loyalty to the crown, and her decision that would cement Andrew's exile. For him, there would be no return. Anne's words were not emotional. They were deliberate, clean, and void of sentiment. This was not a sister writing to her brother, it was a senior royal making an institutional declaration. Since the passing of Queen Elizabeth, Anne's influence had risen with quiet force. She had become the monarchy's stabilizer, the one who neither courted the press nor played into palace drama, but who knew exactly when to strike. And this was her moment. After watching the chaos unfold around George's Eton ceremony and seeing the boundaries William had been forced to draw alone, Anne made her move not through a meeting, not through whispers, but through pen and paper, the oldest form of royal command. Her disappointment in Andrew bled through the elegance of her language. She wrote not as a sister hurt by betrayal, but as a custodian of legacy sickened by recklessness. She referenced the weight of duty, the damage of self-interest, and the irreversible consequences of choosing one's pride over one's role. But the true blow came in one paragraph short, devastating final, where she wrote that any future attempt by Andrew to involve himself with the heirs would be seen as a direct act of defiance against the sovereign direction of the crown. In simple terms, he wasn't just barred, he was erased. Anne's letter to William was even more precise. It contained only one line: "You did what needed to be done." And with that, she reinforced the message that William had not overreached, he had upheld the values they were all sworn to protect. Charles, upon reading both letters, reportedly paused in silence. While he had hoped the storm might settle on its own, Anne's firmness left no room for delay. He agreed, perhaps not loudly, but decisively, that the issue was no longer one to navigate quietly. It was one to close. Andrew's response was silence. Days later, his staff confirmed that he had permanently returned to Royal Lodge. No statement, no appearance, no denial. He retreated into the vast estate with the same defiance that once propelled him forward, but without the audience he so desperately wanted back. His isolation was no longer a quiet separation. It was a marked exile, endorsed by every corner of the family that still mattered. And it was Princess Anne, not the monarch or the heir, who had delivered the final blow. As silence falls around Andrew and the future rises through George, one truth remains unshaken. The monarchy protects its own, especially when the past tries to claw its way back. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.